So as you know, or perhaps you don't, so you should, school budget votes are coming up tomorrow. Again, this year it looks like most districts are staying under the 2% property tax cap. That's sort of like a 2%, and we'll talk about that in a bit. In fact, only 12 districts are putting out a budget with a higher increase, and of course that means that they'll need 60% voter approval in order to get those passed. One thing that may help other districts limit spending increases is declining enrollment. The New York State Association of School Business Officials analyzed numbers from the State Education Department and found that more than half of districts in New York actually saw their populations drop, albeit slightly. Here to talk more about the trends is the group's executive director, Michael Borges. It's great to see you back.
Thank you for having me.
So first of all, you are using the property tax report card numbers that the districts are required, all but the big five.
Correct.
Are required to report to SED.
Correct.
So to the best of our knowledge, this is the most accurate information out there.
To the best of our knowledge, so help me God.
So help me God. So overall, the levy increase is 1.69%.
Right.
And actually spending is increasing at about 2.3%. So districts are, generally speaking, spending more than they're bringing in.
Well, I mean, that doesn't include their
state aid,
the state aid,
which went up.
Which went up by, as you know, to 4.4%, $1 billion. So, I mean, this is sort of a status quo, stable year for school districts. Between the higher tax cap this year, as you mentioned, it was 1.26. Last year, it was 0.12, a historic low. So between the higher tax cap bringing in more revenue, the modest increase in state aid, it's generally a good, stable year for school districts.
Yeah, just to make sure everybody understands, we call it the 2% tax cap, but it's really not. It's 2% or whatever's less, actually, technically speaking.
Well, it's a combination. I mean, each school district has its own cap based on its own circumstances, its own revenue, its own exclusions from the cap. So, I mean, each school district will have its own cap. Some will have, below 2%, and some will have above 2%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you mentioned, I mean, since it's a status quo year, again, which is kind of depressing, particularly if you happen to be a parent or student in one of these districts, the high-need districts are still in a high-need situation and still spending more than they can afford. They're required to spend more than they can afford, and they really are not able to go back to their tax base because they don't have a tax base to tax.
Right. You picked up on something interesting. They hit the trifecta in terms of the high-need urban, suburban school districts. According to our analysis, they had the highest spending increase, the lowest levy increase, which means the lowest tax increase, and they also had the highest increase in students. So the number of students has been increasing, which is driving the spending, but they can't really raise any money locally because they're so poor. So which is why state aid is so crucial to these kinds of school districts, whether they're rural or urban school districts. Is the state aid is supposed to supplement and help them to deal with the fact that they don't have any local resources.
So these districts that are seeing increases, usually it's due to an influx of immigrants, not always. And again, we're talking in generalities here, but we're trying to figure out what the trends are that we see in the numbers. And those populations usually need a higher degree of services, particularly when it comes to ESL, English as a second language. So what you're saying here, after looking at the numbers and analyzing them, is the state really is going to have to step up and assist some of these urban high-need schools because that's where the pressure is and they can't help themselves.
Correct. We're actually, every year for the last 4 or 5 years, we've been doing a school finance symposium, and you've actually hosted one recently. And our next one is in September, October of the coming year, and we're going to focus on the changing demographics of student populations because you hit the nail right on the head because, the student population may be declining overall, but the part that is increasing is those with the highest needs in terms of English language learners. You have people with disabilities or special needs, immigrants. So they all come to the school district with a lot of special requirements. Yeah. And those special requirements often are more expensive. So we have to take a look at how the changing demographics of our student population is going to impact academic learning and also our school finances.
Yeah, and I mean, let's also say, yes, it puts stress on districts and it's an uncomfortable conversation to have, but also you're talking about immigrant communities that are vibrant, that are bringing cultural diversity into some of these districts, which is good, and also helping revive some urban centers, particularly upstate, that lost a lot of population. So there's a good and bad in there.
Oh, yes.
And a support from the state would be helpful, actually, for these districts, certainly. And, you know, I know that Schenectady is having an event today to thank the state for an increase, their school district, in aid, which was huge. And you're talking about, that's a district that actually sued at one point.
Correct, yeah.
Because arguing that the formulas that the state uses disproportionately negatively impacts kids of color and poor kids of color.
Right. Well, I think they're also part of the small cities court case as well, which still has yet to be resolved.
Yes, indeed.
Finally.
And also, you're looking, it's interesting, those 12 districts that are going for an override.
Right, it dropped considerably from last year.
It has, yeah.
36 last year.
But it's all, I mean, there's one in the Hudson Valley. Other than that, it's really Western New York and in the northern area, which I find sort of, why? Do you know?
It depends on the local circumstances. There was actually only one school district on the list this year that was on the list last year. It was Franklin, which is in the southern tier, which is a small rural school district. So, I mean, it depends on whether they had a capital project go off the line, or they had a huge increase in it. Because what happens is when you have a lot of cases where you have the overrides, there's also the fact that they have a negative tax levy, which means they can't spend more than, or they can't levy more than they had last year. So they try to do an override. So there's some correlation between school districts that have negative tax levies and the overrides.
Yeah, and usually, just to be clear, we don't want to frighten anybody. I mean, we are seeing a very high percentage of passage. It's like 99, 98.
Since the inception
really
of the tax
high.
cap, it's been over 95%. In the last 2 years, it's been 99%.
Right.
So yeah, the passage rate has been
But you should vote. You should go out and vote.
Well, that's
tomorrow.
the other problem.
It's very
is
important.
That with
Turnout
the
is
advent
low.
of the tax cap, yeah, I mean, it's decreased 40% since 2010. And even more, even the negative votes have even decreased even more, like 61%.
So before we run out of time, let's just also talk about foundation aid. You know, I mean, at some point we're going to have to tackle the elephant in the room that is foundation formulas and fully funding the formula, or maybe blowing up the formula and coming up with something else that's more fair, that's not based on outdated poverty numbers, et cetera.
Well, the foundation aid formula works when it's used.
Well, when it's allowed to run as
exactly.
it's supposed
yes,
to, right? Yeah.
And you know, and I've said before, I mean, the distribution of school aid is very much a political process.
Sure.
So when politics gets involved, the formula gets tweaked or amended or changed to drive money based on politics and not necessarily based on what the formula would have allowed.
Before we run out of time, I also want to just touch base with you for the rest of the session. I mean, we are seeing some machinations that really don't involve upstate schools, but there is an education component, and that is that the Senate Majority Leader, who's never been a big fan of the New York City Mayor, Bill de Blasio, and we're talking of here, and John Flanagan, is threatening to hold hostage the idea of re-upping mayoral control in New York City until and such time that they get an increase in charter cap for New York City, right? And again, that doesn't impact upstate so much, but does it set a negative precedent? I mean, this idea, I know it's political and things get held hostage all the time.
Yeah, I mean, the things are always tied to one another, so whether it's tied to charter schools or healthcare or whatever, I mean, it's, you know, it's a horse trading that goes on. If the Assembly wants one thing, and they want mayoral control, and the Republicans in the Senate want something else, then that horse trading has to happen. Whether it's increase in charter schools or something else that's unrelated to education, it happens all the time and shouldn't be unexpected.
Yeah, but does it bother the organization at all that, you know, we're having mayoral control there's been sort of intermittent discussions in some of the other big 5 cities. It's never really gotten off the ground, though certainly there are mayors who would like to see it happen because they'd like more control over their districts. And this idea that you only some mayors merit multi-year mayoral control while other mayors do not in the eyes of the legislature seems to be awfully unfair.
Well, again, I think Senator Flanagan has said that mayoral control will continue, whether it's for a year or 2 years, or, you know, it remains to be seen. But again, and you know, New York City is a whole island unto itself, literally and physically.
Yeah, indeed.
So you know, what happens there may not impact or really be a precedent setting for the rest of the state.
So is there anything else for the rest of the session that you've got your eye on that we should be watching?
Well, again, you know, I've had this conversation with others about how when the tax cap got instituted, there was supposed to be mandate relief. The governor created a mandate relief council. You know, they gave us one half of the loaf and didn't get the other half of the loaf. And you know, the tax cap caps our revenue. It caps our local revenue. It doesn't cap our expenses.
Right.
So what we need is some assistance with lowering or at least mitigating our expenses. And so far, the state has failed to deliver on that part of it.
Indeed. Well, you know, it would be nice, in fact, if the state took over the entire share of local Medicaid, as some certain members of Congress would like to see, but I don't think that's going to be happening.
It wouldn't help school districts.
Well, not so much, but, you know, we'll see. Anyway, thank you, Michael. I do appreciate it, as always.
Thank you for having me.
And we will see what happens tomorrow.